This week, we are talking about the bad words of the Bible. Hello, everybody. My name is Payton. I'm one of the ministers here at the Vero Beach Church of Christ, and we are just at the beginning of a new young adult series that we are in the middle of called Christianese, Unlearning Christianese. What are these words that are part of the Christian language, like holiness, or exile, or Messiah, and what do they mean? What's their impact, and how can we unlearn the cultural context of them and relearn the actual biblical context of them? So that's what this series is all about. Today we're talking about the bad words. Now, I'm not talking about inflammatory or derogatory phrases. I'm talking about the words that are trying to hone in on the negativeness of the human heart and the human condition. These three words, and yes, we're going to cover three words, and we're going to group them all together. These three words are sin, transgression, and iniquity. All words that you probably don't use outside of a church building or outside of Christian conversations. Why? Because these are biblical words, biblical concepts, and unfortunately, we have distanced ourselves from them. So when we read them in the Bible, we oftentimes will be like, oh, they're all basically the same word, they mean bad things, and we move on. Really missing out on what the Bible has to say about the human condition, the condition of the human heart and the human mind, and how we interact with each other. And so this lesson is going to be all about those three words. So we're going to begin with the word sin. That is like the foundation, the bedrock word. So the word sin, kata, in Hebrew, it simply means to miss the mark. So I often like to think of like an archer aiming for with his bow at a target. He releases it and the arrow flies and hits like at the bottom left corner, right? He's aiming for a bullseye. He misses the mark, right? And that is all that word means. In fact, the word kata is not even a spiritual word in its original origins. It simply means to miss the mark. And in fact, you can find the word sin, kata, right, in your Hebrew Bible in places that has nothing to do with the moral decisions or moral character. For example, Judges chapter 20, verse 16, it talks about these military men who were able to sling a stone and hit a hair off of somebody's head. They do not miss the mark, right? They do not sin is what that word would be there, but obviously it has nothing to do with their moral character. Another one is Proverbs chapter 19, verse 2. It says, desire without knowledge is not good, and whoever makes haste with his feet misses his way. If you make haste, if you don't plan out a destination, you will miss where you're going to end up, just like any circumstance in which you're trying to get somewhere and you don't take time to actually look up directions, you might get lost and miss the mark, right? This is simply a word that had its cultural meaning, and the biblical authors, they capture it because it has some spiritual implications when we think about it in that context. So that raises the question, what is the mark? If we're missing the mark, what is the mark? And you can find the answer to that in the beginning pages of our Bible, where the Bible lays out that all humans are made in the image of God. They are made in the Imago Dei, and therefore every human being should be treated with dignity and respect. And to not love God and to not love others, that is missing the mark. This is why when Jesus is questioned, what is the greatest commandment? How can I hit the mark? Jesus says, love your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. These are the greatest commandment. And what he's saying is to hit the mark is to love God and to love other people. That is captured in Exodus chapter 20 in the 10 Commandments with Israel, this nation that God has selected. You will be my select holy people set apart from everybody else. And here is a law, a instruction manual on how you can live the righteous, marked life. And on that, the first, and I'm not going to go through the 10 Commandments, but you can go read them in Exodus 20 yourself. The first half is all about loving God in our relationship with Him. I should have no other gods before you. And the second half is how can we love each other? Do not steal, do not murder, do not disrespect your mother and father, and so on and so forth. Right? It's all about our relationship with God and with other people. And that is why sin against people is ultimately sin against God. I want you to think of Genesis chapter 39, verse 9. Joseph, a man of God, who has been sold off by his brothers and finds himself in the Egyptian captivity, eventually raises in rank in that, and he is pursued and tried to be captured by Potiphar's wife in some kind of sexual activity. And if you go there, Genesis 39, verse 9, what you'll see, what Joseph say is, how could I commit such a sin against God? Not against you, though that would be a sin, but in Joseph's mind, a sin against a person is equally connected to a sin against God. Joseph makes that connection, and the biblical authors want us to make that connection as well. So a question I asked in this session: can people sin without knowing they are sinning? And everybody at the table said a very conclusive yes. People can sin without recognizing they are missing the mark. In the biblical example, you have people like Pharaoh, who was building an empire, who was building a place of economic security. But in the process, he was jeopardizing his humanity. He was putting, he had slaves under him, Hebrew slaves, who he was mistreating. He was not treating his neighbor, his fellow person, as a person with dignity and respect, and therefore he was sinning in the process. In modern examples, the easy one is like Hitler, who might think he has a righteous path, but doesn't. And is sinning in the process. So let's talk about, before we move on to the second words, let's talk about the very first place that sin is mentioned. It's actually in Genesis chapter 4, verse 7. Cain, the first son, has just murdered his brother Abel, the second son, because he got jealous of him and Abel's connection and favor in God's eyes. And whenever Cain is found out of his sin, or of his act, God says, the very first time he uses sin, he says, be careful, because sin, missing the mark, sin is like a wild beast, and it's crouching, ready to pounce and devour you. And this is an extremely important metaphor and understanding of the word sin. Sin is like a wild animal that lives inside every single person, and its desire is to feed off of your desires. This is an important thing to notice, that sin does not care about you. It's not trying to help you prosper. It's a wild animal. It's how the Bible describes it. It has no care. Its only care is to be fed and to grow stronger. And it grows stronger in each of us. You see, sin is not something that lives out there. Neither is evil, neither is darkness. Sin is something that lives directly in here and here. And it's in each of us. And the evil and the sin that exists in the world, it's because it flows out of my heart into the world, and yours, and your neighbors, and your coworker, and your spouse, and so forth. We are all contributing to the evil and sin that exists in the world. And so, if we take that metaphor, don't feed that wild animal. Don't let it feed off of your desires and your wants. Discipline your heart and focus on God, and focus on loving God and loving other people. Another place, Romans chapter 7, verse 15, Paul describes sin as living inside of us. So I do what I do not want to do, and I don't do what I want to do, he says. I don't want to do this sin, but I do it. Why? Because it's this animal eating up inside of me. That's what sin is. That's what missing the mark is. Now let's talk about real quick these next two words. Let's start with transgression. So we're talking about sin is missing the goal. It's our failure to love God and love other people. But there's a word used in the Bible specifically talking about our violation of our relationship with other people. And that is the word pesha, often translated transgression. So this is an important thing to note. Pesha, you don't pesha against somebody, but rather you pesha with somebody. And here's what I mean by that. If an ancient Israelite stole from somebody, that was called thievery, right? You stole something that didn't belong from you. But if an ancient Israelite stole from their neighbor, that was called pesha, because you didn't just steal the thing. It wasn't just thievery, but you broke something. You broke a trust between you and your neighbor. And that's what labels it as pesha. It's something directly connected to a relationship. And if you go look through some of the minor prophets, Micah, Amos, you're going to find examples of nations breaking their relationships with other nations and with God in the process. Nations ignore, they justify the mistreatment of humans in the name of national security, in the name of a strong economy, and those things are still happening today. But for the prophets, this was an extreme injustice for humanity. It is breaking a relational trust between two people that were made in the image of God, and it's pesha, it's breaking a trust between those two. So Romans chapter 5, verse 15, Paul talks about instead of letting humanity destroy itself to this type of treachery between each other, what God did is he raised up a human who would allow everybody's pesha to do the worst to him. Jesus took on the weight of everybody's pesha, and God's response to all of our pesha is to be trustworthy in the process. God takes on the nastiness of our kata, our sin, the desires that feed off of our desires. He takes on the weight of that, but he also takes on the weight of our pesha, the way that we let each other down and we break that trust. So that's pesha, transgression. The last word I want to talk about is the word iniquity, the word avon in Hebrew. And this is often branches off from the word avah. And the word avah has no negative meaning. It simply means to be crooked or bent. So when you think of avah, you can think of like Psalms chapter 38, verse 6, where it talks about, I am utterly bowed down before you, God. I am bent over, right? That is avah. So what the biblical authors did is they took that word and they wanted to capture human behavior. Often in the biblical text, this can be translated into like perverted, something that is crooked, off the path, not how it was designed to be. It's a great image for the biblical authors. It is the leveling of choices of our conscience. Instead of them being on a straight path, how they should be, they are crooked and bent off. I want to read from Isaiah chapter 59. So you have become, in this very quick video, you have become a little Bible scholar. And we've captured the word sin. We've captured the word transgression as breaking trust, as an animal devouring and eating our desires. And now iniquity of something being crooked, perverted. And I want to read this verse in Isaiah 59, verses 12 through 15, where all of these words come together and we find their own meaning. So, starting in verse 12 of Isaiah 59, for our transgressions are multiplied before you. Our sins, they testify against us. For our transgressions are with us, and we know our iniquities, our crookedness, transgressing and denying the Lord, and turning our back and following our God. Speaking oppression and revolt, conceiving and uttering from the heart lying words. Justice is turned back, and righteousness, it stands far away from us. For truth has stumbled in the public squares, and uprightness cannot enter. Truth is lacking, and he who departs from evil makes himself a prey. Avon, you see, it not only associates with the broken behavior of humans, but it also associates with the broken consequences of our actions. You see, this is what justice looks like for God, is allowing people to fall under, at least partially, not wholly, but at least partially, under the consequences, under the weight of their own actions. This is why in like Leviticus chapter 5, verse 17, you hear this phrase, to bear their iniquities. So oftentimes, in the biblical narrative, you find nations like Babylon, who oppressed nations, brought them into captivity, suppressed them into obedience and submission. And the same way Babylon rose to power is the same way that it fell. Those very nations would one day oppress and suppress Babylon. And this is often what God allows happen. The very thing the injustice that you bring on other people, the pervertedness, the iniquity you bear on other people, you will have bore on you as well. But God has another response as well, to carry our Avon for us. Psalm chapter 32, verse 5. Let me find this for you. It says, I acknowledge my sin to you. This is psalmist crying out to God. I acknowledge my sin to you. I didn't cover my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord. And what happens? And you forgave the iniquity of my sin. This is the remarkable thing about Jesus. Yes, we have these minor consequences to our actions, but the consequences that we deserve, Jesus decided to bear. I will take on that punishment that you deserve, the consequences that you've earned. I will take those on. I will allow them to crush me and destroy me so they don't do that to you. Sin, this wild animal that feeds off of our desires, that's crooked and evil inside of us. Transgression is this thing I break with somebody. It's a trust that used to exist, but I decide to break it. I don't love my neighbor as myself. And Avon, iniquity, this crookedness, this pervertedness of the path I should be going on, the path of God, but bent out of shape. This is not how it was supposed to be. You see, the biblical story is God's desire to take broken people that live twisted lives in a twisted, broken world and to make them right again. And he does that, and his plan of salvation is through Jesus. I will take on the weight of your consequences so that you can be set right, so that you can choose to self-discipline yourself, so you can choose to love your neighbor as yourself and in the process love God. That is what it means to hit the mark. That is our aim. That is our goal. And that is the bad words of the Bible.